Once again, a analogy for our introduction came to me this week from Everybody Loves Raymond. If you don't like the show, you'll eventually get tired of me thinking of analogies from it, but here it is. It's from season 7, and the episode is entitled Jealous Robert. And in the episode, Robert's mother and sister-in-law, Marie and Deborah, hatch a scheme to get Robert back together with his ex-girlfriend, Amy, because they, of course, want him to marry her, and they're trying to help. So they set Amy up with Ray's friend, Gianni, and Gianni's the character to Amy's left in that picture. There's only one problem with this foolproof plan, of course, and that is that Amy and Gianni hit it off. They're actually a good couple. And Robert ends up confronting Amy in his jealousy, which is, of course, what they wanted him to feel, and says something pretty horrible to Amy, making things worse than they ever were before, and making the prospect of them getting together again even more dim. So why did Marie think that she could manipulate her son into getting back together with his ex-girlfriend? Well, she thought that because she did the exact same thing to her husband while they were dating. In their youth, Marie let Frank, her boyfriend at the time, whom she was trying to get to propose to her, but as he delightfully says to his son in that episode, there were a lot of other fish in the sea and I wasn't ready to hang up my tackle box, which, is lovely. She lets Frank find out that she's going to cook dinner for another man, a man named Chuck Pecorella. At which point, Frank flies into a jealous rage as he says to Ray, "I was once so jealous of your mother that I put my fist through a DeSoto. They stitched up my hand. I went straight to her house, and from then on, she cooks only for me." Ray says, "Dad, that's a nice story." And of course, Frank says, "Yeah, I don't like to tell it because it doesn't have a happy ending." And then later in the episode, they're talking as the scheme unfolds, as everything falls apart in typical sitcom fashion. They mention Chuck Pecorella again, and Frank overhears it, and he goes, "Whatever happened to Chuck Pecorella? That guy owes me. I'm serving his sentence." So Frank and his view of their marriage, not the best, but jealousy used in order to make something, in order to try to get someone to do something. It's an interesting theme because that's actually what Paul is talking about this morning in Romans 11, 7-15. Let's take a look at the text and we'll see where jealousy comes in. It says, "What then? What the people of Israel sought so earnestly, they did not obtain. The elect among them did, but the others were hardened. Now that we know that God's promise to Abraham continues in the new covenant through the faithful remnant," that's what we learned in last week's message, the faithful remnant who embrace Jesus as Messiah, the covenant promises continue through them. Paul now ponders, well, what comes next with respect to those who do not accept Jesus? What about the rest of the Jewish people? What about the rest of the children of Abraham? What happens to them with respect to God and God's promises? Now, Paul has already made clear numerous times in Romans that the failure of his people in this generation was not from lack of effort, and he repeats that here. They wanted to please God. They thought that they were by focusing on keeping the law. And they poured their effort into that pursuit. Nevertheless, as we know, when the Messiah came, they were not ready to receive him. It's an interesting case study to seek to understand, where did this go wrong? Why did this people become fixated on their own self-righteousness? How did their attempt to please God go so awry? Why did they forget the lessons of their ancestors' interactions with God, which of course they studied all the time in the Scriptures? But that it happened really isn't all that surprising, because faith requires humility, and self-righteousness feeds human pride. We've seen more than enough of this failing in both the church today and in the history of the church to know that this tendency to look inward at ourselves, to build ourselves up rather than upward at God, remains one of the primary pitfalls of the people of God, whether it's Israel of old or the church today. In this case, the minority who avoided that pitfall of self-righteous, those who accepted faith in Jesus, as Paul reminded us last week, were the elect, those chosen by the grace of God. But what of those who foolishly trusted in themselves instead of relying upon the mercy of God? What happened to them? We're told here, they were hardened. And the term reminds us of a callus. Maybe you have one on your toes, on your foot, or on your hand. I have one right here where I hold my pencil because I hold it in kind of an odd way. I hold it right there. I've had that callus on my finger for my whole life. So we understand what a callus does. And the callus of self-righteousness, that attitude, it dulls our senses until we can't feel the grace of God anymore, until it doesn't make an impact. Those mental and emotional barriers that they themselves erected through their pride, through their belief in their own righteousness, they proved to be so formidable that when Jesus came, they didn't recognize him. So Paul begins by talking about that. Then he says, as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, ears that could not hear to this very day. And David says, may their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, their backs be bent forever. The first part of the quote here in verse 8 is from the book of Deuteronomy. When the people of God, when his chosen people, the ones that he himself, through Moses, led up out of Egypt toward the promised land, when they didn't learn from the many, many miracles that they saw with their own eyes. They had eyes, but they didn't see. The second part is from the prophet Isaiah, when the descendants of that generation were themselves confronted by prophet after prophet, Elijah and Isaiah and Jeremiah and all of the rest. But they couldn't hear the message of the judgment of God approaching. They had ears, but they did not hear. In verses 9 and 10, Paul is quoting David from Psalm 69. David certainly knew an awful lot about those who would oppose the will of God. He witnessed that firsthand with King Saul, who demonstrated that capacity with violence for many years while he was trying to kill David. It's little wonder that David approved of the hand of judgment from God, approved of God cutting off those who fight against his purpose. These three different quotes from the Old Testament remind us that Paul's generation was nowhere near the first to fail like this. There is sadly a long history of such things going back into his people's past. So Paul gets to the question that is on his mind. Again, I asked, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. We know that the Jews of Paul's generation who could not see Jesus' miracles or hear his teachings made a grave error in rejecting the Messiah sent to them by God. This failure is devastating for that one generation. But what does it mean for those that follow? Does it doom all the generations after them? Paul says no. Just as God gave Joshua's generation a chance after he rejected Moses's, just as God restored Israel under Ezra and Nehemiah after he had exiled them in the days of Jeremiah and Daniel, so too will God continue to work with and in and through the descendants of Abraham in fulfillment of that ancient, unbreakable promise. So we know that it is not the end. The question now becomes when? When will a restoration occur? When will God bring his chosen people back into fellowship through his Son? And what happens until then? We'll return to the question of when that restoration will occur later when Paul gets back to it. Now our focus is on the time in between. What's going to happen? What is God going to do between the time that most of his people rejected him, his Messiah, and the time when God changes that? Paul says, rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. This is what God is up to in the meantime. We call this portion of God's redemptive plan the church age. It began at Pentecost nearly 2,000 years ago. We don't know how long it's going to last because we're living in the middle of it right now. The previous era, what we refer to as the Mosaic Covenant. And it lasted about 1,500 years, depending on where you date the Exodus in history, beginning with the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. There are many purposes in God's plan for this age. Things that the Spirit is working through the followers of Jesus, in other words, us, his church, that he will accomplish. Global evangelism being the one that we think of most often. So here the Apostle Paul offers us one more purpose, one more reason for this age, for this time of the church. It's to make the Israelites jealous by saving the Gentiles. So let's put that thought in context to help us see why non-Jews, people like us, coming to God would make them jealous. Why would that be the result? So let's back it up. Beginning with Abraham, God set apart his people, Abraham and his descendants, to be in his words, a peculiar people. And by peculiar, I don't mean that they were supposed to be odd or weird. I mean they were supposed to be different. God commanded them to be different than all the neighboring peoples. It suited God's purpose that they would stand out. They would be monotheists in a sea of polytheistic peoples. They would be a people who built no idols and worshiped no idols in a sea of people who did. Why? Because God chose them to be a light shining in the darkness, a beacon of hope in a very troubled world. And for that to work, they could not be like any other people. So let's fast forward from that beginning through many, many generations to follow under that dynamic where the people of God are different than everyone around them. Some of those generations were good, and the people were serving God, and everything was good. Some of them were bad, and there was judgment, and the prophets came to warn. But the isolation of being different was consistent throughout that whole time period as generations and years roll by. That isolation, combined with a clear calling and a purpose, over time contributed to a belief amongst them that as the chosen people, they were in fact superior to their neighbors. Not just different, but better. What was created to be a lighthouse in stormy seas morphed into hubris and haughty derision about the uncircumcised, as they called them. It's not shocking that this happened. And if you think, well, they did that, but surely we never would, let me introduce you to the United States of America. We're celebrating the 4th of July in a couple of days, and unless you know, our history is a whole lot shorter than Israel's was by the time of Paul, right? Just a few hundred years. And by the way, we had no divine promises at our founding. Don't let people's imagination tell you otherwise. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were not led by the hand of God. They didn't go up on a mountain to speak with God. None of that stuff. Israel had all of that in their history. And yet, do we not see Americans, just like the British before us who did the exact same thing when it was their turn, often feeling scorn toward the rest of the world, as if we are better than them? Must be something about us why our land is so prosperous and so free, right? We must be better. If you don't think that attitude exists, just look around. It does. Well, with that dynamic in mind, pride in themselves combined with scorn about other peoples, think about how the news would be received in Jerusalem that crowds of Egyptians and Greeks and Romans and Babylonians and on, were now following the one who claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. They didn't want him, but these other peoples are falling all over themselves, it seems, to be his disciples. Suddenly, in one generation, those people, the people they scorn, the people they don't think much of, they have now come to believe that they are God's children, which is what we always called ourselves. Now they think they are. And they're doing that without ever having to come to the temple in Jerusalem, without having to come to the priests, without bringing a sacrifice, without being circumcised, without following the kosher rules, without the Sabbath, without any of it. And yet they think that they can approach God. They think that they can call God Abba, Father, etc., etc. Imagine how that news would be received amongst a people for countless generations who have thought of themselves as God's chosen people. These Gentiles are coming to God without any of the hallmarks that made us special, is what they're going to think. In their view, what made them special, at least. Not to mention that they're now reading the Greek translation of your own scriptures. When they get together to worship, these Christ followers, they are using our scriptures. They're singing the Psalms of David as if they're their songs. And they invite anyone and everyone to join them. Everyone is welcome. Slave and free, male and female, it doesn't matter to them. See any reason why that turn of events might make the people jealous? I certainly do, and the Apostle Paul saw it as well. He says, if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? Before Paul explains why God wants Abraham's descendants to be jealous, he first comments on how advantageous to most of his readers who were Gentiles this current shift of God's redemptive emphasis to the Gentiles has been. Now there's a what if in all of this. What if the current generation of Jews had largely accepted Jesus instead of rejecting him? Would God still have sent the gospel to the non-Jews? Absolutely. This was God's plan from the beginning. When God spoke to Abraham in Genesis 12, he told them, through you all nations will be blessed. God always envisioned the redemption of all the world's peoples. God did not cause the Israelites to reject Jesus so that he could take the gospel to the Gentiles. He had no need. He overcame their rejection through the faithful remnant, including his own hand-picked disciples, in order to ensure that the good news about salvation in Jesus would spread like wildfire. My apologies for that analogy at the moment. I know a couple days ago we had the smoke down here again from Canada. But that's the best analogy to imagine how quickly the gospel was spreading in that first generation. We know God can overcome our failings to fulfill his will. Here Paul wonders how glorious the future could be if God didn't have to with respect to his fellow Israelites. What if they would return to the Lord? And we're going to get back to that message in 2 weeks, because Paul will end this section by talking about that future renewal. So hold on to that thought about the future. Paul says, I'm talking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I take pride in my ministry in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. That young, fiery, cocky Saul of Tarsus, who Paul used to be, had no interest in sharing his knowledge of the one true God with Greeks and Romans. He had no desire to go to Asia Minor and Greece and Italy to tell them about God. He cared about the purity, as he saw it, of Judaism. He cared about observance, strict observance of the law of Moses. Well, that attitude he left behind on the road to Damascus when he spoke to the resurrected Jesus Christ. We wouldn't have seen it in him, but God saw in that young man the perfect person to take the gospel beyond Israel. God, of course, was right. The massive importance of Paul to church history confirms that God knew what he was doing. At this point in his career, Paul says, I am the apostle to the Gentiles, a role he was now, many years after that Damascus experience, now he is famous as being the apostle to the Gentiles. And he's willing to wear that badge with a certain amount of swagger, hoping that in doing so, he might make his own people envious. He might make them jealous enough to seek out Jesus and see what they're missing out on. Why are all those Gentiles rushing after Jesus? What's going on there? He's hoping to have that effect. History tells us that so far, God's inclusion of the Gentiles in his plan hasn't convinced more than just a minority of the Jewish people in the subsequent generations from when Paul wrote these hopeful words to embrace Jesus as Messiah and Savior. So far, some of them has been about as far as it has gone. This is then an ongoing burden on the heart of God, watching his covenant people continue in the exile of their own making. One that we will see in 2 weeks what the conclusion to it will be. Paul was confident that God would one day make a remedy to this situation, that he would fix it. And so he ends by musing here, for if their rejection brought reconciliation to the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? Paul had no way of knowing how long the era in which his people didn't wholly accept Jesus would last. The generation that disobeyed in the desert ended up wandering for 40 years. The generations taken into exile in Babylon had to wait 70 years. Given that the rejection of the Son of God, who came in the flesh amongst them, is a far greater failure than those previous ones, it's not shocking that this time has lasted longer. How much longer? For that, you have to ask the Father. He's the only one that knows. In the meantime, the gospel has transformed one people group after another, one nation after another, bringing reconciliation to thousands upon thousands of places all over the world, and now in the modern era to billions upon billions of people. What God has done for and through His church is glorious. The praise that we, His adopted children, offer in response is beyond measure. It is a success story any way you slice it, and one beyond the dreams of those dozen men that Jesus called and told to go into the world with the gospel. But even with all that, Paul ends this section by wondering how much more glorious it will be when God turns the rejection of Jesus by His people around. Lazarus was in the tomb for 3 days when Jesus called him back to life. What an amazing moment that was as the people gathered around in their joy to see him alive again. Imagine the joy the world over when that day comes, when God calls the entire Jewish people into the light of the gospel. It was a hope for the future that helped Paul, at least somewhat, to be able to carry the pain of his people's messianic rejection throughout his life. 3 thoughts of application, 3 things I want you to remember from this text. Number 1, God is indeed merciful. The rejection of Jesus by His own people was a stumbling that led to a hardening, but it did not invalidate God's promises to them. Secondly, one of the purposes of the church age is to make the descendants of Abraham jealous, which leads to this. The goal of that jealousy is very simple. It is the salvation of the Jewish people.